Hello and welcome to Stony Brook University's Community of Scholars webcast. We're here with part 2 about our discussion surrounding mental health in college-age and young populations. So our previous discussion focused on Elizabeth's personal story and her experiences with mental illness and suicidal thoughts. And so this time we're going to talk more about the larger scale social effects at play when people do develop these conditions. So mental illness is a huge problem amongst college students, as you can probably attest to yourself. And the Best Tech project from Stony Brook University has released data that shows that depression is the most common form of disability amongst college-aged and young populations. Up to 70% of individuals who are suffering from depression don't get the help that they need. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the barriers you experienced when you went to try and seek help. You mentioned growing up in a small town and the fear that everyone would know your business and the social ramifications that would come with people knowing you were in treatment, essentially.
Yeah, so growing up in a small town, you literally couldn't close a door without the whole town finding out about it. And as I mentioned previously, like a rumor that wasn't even true spread like wildfire. So something that is true, it doesn't even matter how severe or not it is. People will take that and run with it, and it'll follow you throughout school, and it'll be brought up, and it'll be used against you. People in small towns have a very pack mentality and tend to attack if they feel for any reason that you deserve it. Even if you don't, they will find a reason that they think that they should attack you, and they will. I've had a whole junior class come at me before.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. So that's definitely one barrier, is just feeling safe enough to do it without getting too much ridicule from your peers. Another thing that I say for me personally is that it's almost like my parents protected me my whole life, and now I was trying to protect them. Because having to find out and cope with your daughter being assaulted is not easy to do.
Yeah.
And then seeing how that affected me my whole life and made my depression worse, it's just, I didn't want them to feel responsible. Yeah, so I just kept it a secret, tried to deal with it on my own. And those were probably the two biggest factors. As soon as I did get into the pop-punk music scene, it became okay to reach out and get help. So many of them had therapists, they were on medications, and I finally felt like it was something that I could do. And it did take me a while. It still took me 2 years, maybe 3, to actually say to my parents, hey, I need help. But I had started looking into options before then, and I was talking to people who I felt I could trust about it. So those were my 2 biggest barriers, and also just self-blame at some point. Not feeling like, oh, it's your fault, you should be able to fix it. And it took me a while to actually stop blaming myself for those things. So those were the different barriers that I personally had to face.
When we were talking about this earlier, you made a great point about how when people talk about assault or sexual violence, they usually come back to what people are wearing and the effect that that has. And a lot of people will self-blame because they were like, oh, I was wearing a bikini, I was wearing fishnets, this is all my fault.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter what you wear. People can get assaulted whether they're wearing a bikini or a burqa, right? It's about the power dynamic.
Yeah, sorry. So what I was saying is that when I was in the Caribbean, I was on the beach all day, every day. So I was wearing a bathing suit all the time, and that wasn't a reason that it was oh, well, she was wearing a bathing suit. Yeah, I was on the beach, I was wearing a bathing suit. And also, when I was 4 years old, tell me what about that was sexy or made me ask for it. That one really bothers me. People just thinking that there's any right they have to a woman's body. Unless she gives express consent, you don't have any right to it. I don't care what she's wearing. I don't care if she's naked. And a woman can revoke consent at any point. And I feel like that is something that for some reason is still so hard for people to get through their heads.
Yeah. It's a huge issue, especially because consent is such a touchy topic for a lot of people, right? And the idea of like revoking consent is not even discussed in most circles.
Yeah.
And we do need to increase the conversation around that in order to adequately address people's needs. And another topic you mentioned that I thought was really interesting was the small town pack mentality, right? And I feel like you can also generalize this to a lot of other demographics. For example, people who grew up in like very religious or traditional households. Like I'm South Asian. I come from a family of people who have a strong connection to their community, to their cultural heritage. And so being involved with people who are from your culture and community is a huge part of like South Asian identity, especially in the diaspora. And so I feel like one of the barriers in people seeking help in those communities is that they don't want, like you said, the information to spread out. They don't want to be isolated, essentially, from the people that they care about and who they depend on for their support and emotional well-being.
Yeah, and as we were also talking about, is that even on college campuses, people tend to fan out into smaller friend groups. And a big thing that happens, and I know this from stories from my friends, is that an assault will happen within the friend group. Say a man assaulted a female friend or vice versa. They don't want to lose all their friends because of that, because they talk about it and they don't want people to not believe them. So there's another issue with like the small pack mentalities, because also people don't want to believe that their friends are capable of things like that.
Yeah, especially because in a lot of, like I see this with a lot of my friends who are Latina and raised in Catholic households, and a lot of my friends who are like South Asian and raised in Muslim or like very traditional Hindu households. You're not really allowed to date, and the idea of like sex before marriage is this huge taboo. So when people do experience sexual assault, they don't feel comfortable coming forward and asking for help. Like that's a huge barrier. And so in your personal, so the silence and the stigma surrounding mental illness and asking for help is a huge contributor to the fact that like 70% of people are not being adequately served. So what are your personal experiences with like silence and the stigma surrounding it?
Well, as I mentioned, I spent the majority of my life not saying a word, and mental illness does, it runs in my family. My brother also tried to commit suicide, has depression, and even my sister, she has anxiety, and she's working through that and just now really talking about it. And I think that it's always been such a cliche topic because the older generations didn't really acknowledge it. They had other excuses for it, like, oh, you're sleeping all day, well, it must just be because you're lazy. Or you're not eating, it doesn't even faze them, you know? And so I think that our generation is doing a really good job of making it an okay topic to talk about, really just checking in on their friends, saying it's okay to get help. I saw this one meme that it was like boomers talking about someone who's going to therapist, and they're whispering like, did you hear that Robin, she's seeing a therapist now? And then it's like millennials, guess what my therapist told me today? And it's like, it's true though. Like, I'll talk about my therapist, Rick, and I'm like, I sent him this meme that I thought was funny. And I'm happy to talk about it. I'm like, oh, he's so great. Like, I think everyone should get therapy. But it comes to boomers, and it's like, it's a topic they don't really want to touch upon, and they have excuses for. And I think that's a big problem in itself, especially with dealing with it with their children. I am so lucky that my parents dealt with it in the way they did. I told my dad one day, he said, what are you, depressed? And I said, actually, I think I am. And he said, we need to get you help. And there was no question in it. It was, we need to find the resources for you and get this worked out. And not all parents are like that. So I think that personally I was lucky because in my family, we just talk about things. There are really no barriers. But in a lot of families, there are, and with a lot of older generations, they don't understand it and they don't want to talk about it. But our generation really is breaking that down and really just saying it's okay to talk about your mental illness. It's okay to see a therapist.
So I'm a psychology major, and one of the things that we learn in our psych classes is that most mental illness, while it's seen as a personal or moral failing, it's more of a disease. It's this thing that eats you up from the inside. And the problem is most people who don't have a language for that, like especially people who are boomers or who come from communities where there isn't a huge discussion around mental health and mental well-being, they tend to see it as more of a moral failing or a personal, like, it's seen as a reflection on you and your family if you do come down with a mental condition. And I feel like what a lot of people don't realize is that there's a huge comorbidity between things like alcoholism and substance use and mental illness, or developing multiple mental illnesses, for example, PTSD and depression, or anxiety and depression. So when people can't seek help when people can't get the help they need, it can spiral into all sorts of directions. And while it might be intimidating for people at first to come across from that, you were very fortunate your family was understanding and your family comes from a medical background.
Mm-hmm.
But for a lot of people who don't have that, it can be very intimidating and potentially devastating to talk to their family about this. And so again, like there's a lot of resources online, like the SAMHSA hotline is 1-800-273-8255. And there's also a lot of websites and things like that where people can get help. And I think that what you mentioned about social media and like going on meeting people from these subcultures where there was this huge discussion surrounding mental illness is a huge factor in that. Because when you normalize a discussion surrounding mental illness, it also makes it easier for people to seek help.
Yeah, no, definitely. As I mentioned, I was so silent about it until I joined that music scene. And every single tweet, pretty much, almost all of them were something about mental health. And this was really before I acknowledged my depression, that I got in the music scene and just kind of started to accept it in myself and just try to get help, try to work on it, try to not make it a topic I couldn't talk about.
Yeah, exactly. So breaking the stigma and breaking the silence along with that is a huge way in which we can better serve people who are experiencing mental illness or mental health problems. Thank you so much for sharing your story. That was amazingly brave of you.
Thank you so much for having me on the show today, and I'm glad that I could share my story, and I hope that this helps students.
And thank you for joining us today, and we also hope that you'll join us next week when we'll hopefully have more answers as to how students can go about seeking help and gaining access to the treatment that they need. This has been a Community of Scholars webcast from Stony Brook University. Thank you for joining us.